The reason we have this bill in front of us, and Social Democrats will be supporting it, I've tabled a number of amendments to improve the bill, and it is unfortunate that there will only be 60 minutes for amendments today, so it means we're likely to be able to discuss one or two of the amendments rather than the number that are in, which doesn't do the legislative process justice. And I do think this bill is needed fast and quick, but we should have had at least a few hours for amendments on it. The reason this bill is in front of us is because the government's housing plan is failing. It's as simple as that. Homelessness is at record levels, rents are at record levels, house prices are at record levels. The number of people living in emergency accommodation for homeless people has increased by 30% in the last 12 months. The number of children living in emergency accommodation has increased by 47% in the last 12 months. That's not to mention people living in direct provision, people fleeing domestic violence and living in refuges, people who are sleeping rough on streets or in tents, or people who are sleeping on couches and on floors. And it's not to mention the hundreds of thousands of people who are still living in their parents' home, even into their late 20s, into their 30s, where they don't want to be, where they want to be able to have some form of independence to get on with their lives. And I'm struck with the comments the Minister made towards the end of his speech, where he said that the government will ensure that we have a rental market that is fit for purpose. And this is all, everything on the government and housing, it's we will do this will happen in the future. But halfway through, they're just telling us, well, this will happen in the future. And fit for purpose for who? Because I haven't heard anything from the government that they intend to make renting fit for purpose in terms of giving renters proper securities. They're not always looking over their shoulder, worried in the pit of their stomach about what will happen if they receive a notice to quit or an eviction. And in many senses, it's that insecurity that really gnaws at people when they're renting, even if they haven't got a notice to quit, even if they're there for years. It's that absolute worry that things might be going well in their lives now, that things might be going well in their kids' lives, that their child's development might be going well, they might be settling into school, they might be overcoming different challenges they have, learning difficulties. It's an absolute worry of what happens if you get the notice to quit. And then when they do get the notice to quit, all of that kicks in, and they can see the years of struggle and progress they've been making to try and get through those challenges in life. They can see those unravelling in front of them. And I don't think there's a proper awareness from that in the government, because if there was, we wouldn't be seeing these kind of piecemeal emergency reactive measures from government. We'd be seeing reforms brought in to make renting secure for renters, as is the case in most other European countries. In terms of the government's failure on housing, they're failing to meet their own targets. The big promise of this government on housing was that it would be building additional supply, new supply, that the number of social homes in the housing delivery targets for this year, last year, would all be additional, would nearly all be additional homes. This was the big promise. We were promised last year 9,500 new build additional social homes. Instead, we got about half of that number in terms of new build additional homes. We were promised a couple of thousand affordable homes from government. Last year we got 0 affordable purchase homes last year. We were promised just 350 cost rental homes last year. We only got 65 of those tenanted. In terms of social housing delivery this year, in terms of new builds, we've less than 2,000 in the first half of the year, when there's 9,000 additional new build social homes promised. And in terms of affordable purchase and cost rental, we only have, in both categories, we only have a few hundred delivered so far this year, when we need thousands of those to meet the government targets, and indeed to meet, we need a lot more than that to meet demand. Not only that, somehow scandalously, given the situation we're in, the government isn't even spending its full allocation in the capital spend on housing. They're 30% behind their own targets now at this time of the year. And if that is made up towards the end, that will be made up, rather than the shortfall will be made up, rather than having a sufficient amount of new build and additional supply, it will be made up the way that governments have always been making that up, in terms of buying up additional supply, existing supply towards the end of the year to try and meet their targets. Certainly better than not doing that, but it's the additional supply that really is needed. We don't have, from the government, they've had talk about needing this these emergency measures for breathing space, but we've no sign of what is the government's plan in terms of that breathing space. In terms of the tenant in situ scheme, I have to say I'm very concerned about the ad hoc and haphazard way this has been implemented across the country. It varies from local authority to local authority, and even within local authorities we're getting mixed messages about how it's been implemented. I appreciate it's a new scheme, but it is an area I think government could probably give more shape on that and more direction to local authorities. I think that would be useful, so that is something that the Minister might look at urgently. And the points made by previous deputies in terms of notifying local authorities, being notified of notices to quit, I think that would be useful, especially in terms of local authorities being proactive then in terms of potential purchases. There's no question that the social housing limits must be raised, and I think all of us are aware of situations where people who've been on housing waiting lists and who are on low incomes and cannot afford to meet their housing needs themselves are being knocked off housing waiting lists because they go slightly above the thresholds, sometimes because they've been doing, I know of people in my constituency who did overtime during COVID when there was other people out sick, just to keep production going in food production and so forth, and they got knocked off the housing waiting list because their earnings went up above, because they were covering for people through once-off overtime and once-off sicknesses because of COVID. Others who've gotten small pay increases from their employers to meet the cost of living crisis and are getting knocked off social housing waiting lists. I mean, this is a brutal thing that is happening to people, including people who've been on the waiting list for a long amount of time and who are close to allocations and will never be able to meet their own housing needs because the government hasn't moved those thresholds up, along with at least the cost of living and inflation. In terms of what happens to people when they do get a notice to quit, and the absolute devastation that can cause, and the stress and anxiety and the disruption in their lives, and the very first thoughts when you're talking to anyone, they're thinking about the rest of their family. They're thinking often about children who may already be suffering with anxiety and mental health issues, and then having a notice to quit where they're being evicted from their home, uprooted from their friends, their family, GAA clubs, anything else they're involved in the local community. It has a devastating impact on this. And it has to be said that this is not a normal practice. This is not what happens in most European countries. The fact is, in most European countries, it's simply not legal to evict renters who are paying their rent simply because the landlord wishes to sell. You can't do it. Totally against the law. In terms of one house, 100 apartments together, whatever it is, you can't do it. You can't do it in Austria. Can't do it in Belgium. Can't do it in the Czech Republic. We've a delegation from the Czech Republic visiting the Oireachtas today. You can't do it in Denmark. You can't do it in Estonia. You can't do it in Germany. You can't do it in Hungary. You can't do it in Latvia. You can't do it in Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania. So what is it that we think that it's okay, or the government thinks it's okay for it to happen in Ireland? I do welcome this as a temporary measure, but if we were in line with most European countries, you couldn't even bring in a temporary measure like this because it's permanently in place that you can't evict people who are from their homes, who are paying their rents simply because a landlord wants to sell. And if landlords want to sell in those countries, they go ahead and sell, and there isn't a problem. And I do have to say this as well, in terms of increased property prices and the value of homes and properties and landlord properties, a lot of that value is given, and we need to recognise that, is given from public investment and public infrastructure. The value of housing and the value of homes, a lot of it is because of the roads put in, the water infrastructure, the wastewater infrastructure, the community facilities, the public transport, and so forth. That gives a lot of the value. So it's not simply the case that this is a private asset that has gone up in value simply from the hard work of the person who owns the property. Actually, a lot of the value has gone in from public investment, not to mention the public subsidies through HAP and so forth as well, which inflate rents, which also increase the value of homes and the value of people's homes that they are being evicted from. In terms of the bill, I do want to reference some of the amendments that I've tabled for the bill. And just before I do that, I want to implore the Minister and the Government to look at, in addition to this, look at what immediate measures can happen to protect people like, for example, the tenants in Tanny House, where over 35 households are being evicted, over 100 people, an entire block facing mass eviction. And the Tyrrellstown amendment that was brought in a few years ago, supposedly to prevent these mass evictions, isn't working. There's too many get-out clauses in it and loopholes that can be exploited. So if the government is looking at emergency measures to stop people being evicted, they should be looking at that and closing down those loopholes as well. Ultimately, the government need to get out of emergency measures, bring in long-term reform. I have to say I do have some sympathy for landlords who complain about all the changes, constant legislative changes. It actually isn't the way to reform the sector. We need one set of changes that bring in proper security for renters. Stop messing around with the sector with incremental changes, causing haphazard changes, incremental piecemeal changes. Bring in proper long-term reforms that give stability to the sector, and then there doesn't have to be multiple changes to legislation each time during the year. Before I get into the amendments that I've tabled on the bill, I do want to mention concerns articulated by the Irish Traveller Movement in relation to this bill, that the measures won't protect travellers from being evicted from temporary accommodation, which is something they have flagged before. And this is specifically relevant in terms of the Irish Traveller Movement noticing an increase in relation to the number of queries and cases they're dealing with in relation to evictions, and particularly relevant in terms of travellers, as we know, are overrepresented in homelessness in 2019, and we don't have complete figures on this, but we do in terms of 2019. 25% of children in emergency accommodation outside of Dublin were travellers, and also 13% of homeless adults, which is a complete representation of the traveller community. So particularly their concerns in this should be noted and taken on board by government. I do think, as others have said, there should be a requirement for local authority to be notified of a notice to quit at the same time as the Residential Tenancies Board are. That would potentially assist in terms of tenants in situ and potentially in terms of acquisitions by the local authority, and that would provide some time in this and potentially take some of the stress out from tenants who are caught in the middle on this. And tenants are incredibly vulnerable when they receive a notice to quit. So them now being put in a position where they're not clear what their role is between them, the landlord, the local authority, and an acquisition is a very stressful situation for them to be put in. In terms of the allowing for evictions on grounds of the property no longer being suitable, I think that should be withdrawn. Threshold they've made the case they've seen an increase in the use of this ground for evicting people. It makes no sense. They argue, for example, that a family with a new child, for example, might be evicted into homelessness on these grounds. That doesn't help anyone, and they've argued very strongly that the moratorium should at least be extended to include people being evicted on those grounds. I would support that, and they've made the case that if this ground is to be retained in terms of overcrowding, then there should be some basis on that. For example, a confirmation from a fire authority that the dwelling is no longer suitable. And they've made the point also there needs to be enhanced support for those in rent arrears. I have also tabled amendments on this in relation to the undermining in terms of tenancy rights that should accrue due to the length of tenancy on this. And also I've tabled to remove amendments to remove grounds for sale as one of the grounds for eviction. As I've said, this simply isn't legal or possible in most European countries. I don't see why the government won't support that. And if the government did do that, that would be a game changer for giving renters more security, for giving stability into the sector, but also very importantly for reducing the number of people being evicted into homelessness. Even Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister in the UK, was promising to bring in no-fault evictions, not a temporary ban, no-fault evictions. Boris Johnson, in my view, a terrible leader of the Tory party. I can't think of much that he's done or promised to do that's commendable, but he was backing that as a measure. Now, if the Tory party can be talking about doing that, you would think this government could at least do it as well. Government of it.